Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vittoria Elliott of Wired and our esteemed panel.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. I'm very excited to discuss user redress and content governance today with members of Meta, the Oversight Board, and the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to get started with everyone sort of giving us a quick background of who they are and how they've come to this topic. So we'll start with you, Pamela.
Thanks so much, Victoria. Great to be here with you on the panel. I'm Pamela San Martin. I'm part of the Oversight Board. That is an independent self-regulatory body created by Meta with guarantees of independence. And I have a background in human rights and in elections. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. My name is Louise Turner. I'm the head of governance at Meta. I'm pretty proud that Meta invests in a standalone governance team and in the governance initiatives that we establish. Essentially, our mission is founded in a fundamental belief that Meta shouldn't make all of its decisions alone. And so we do what we can to embed and empower external voices into Meta's platforms and its products. And we do that by, in 2020, establishing the Oversight Board, which empowers users by making the most significant and difficult decisions. And we also run really large-scale community forums, which are about public representation in our emerging technologies.
My name is Duffy. I'm a senior fellow for digital and cyberspace policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I think I started engaging with my first social media platform in 2008 in terms of questions of platform governance and local impacts. And so this is something that I have worked on living throughout Cuba, through Colombia, through Tunisia, through South Africa. And so I think a lot about how the decisions of a centralized body affect users globally.
My name's Thomas Hughes. I was the founding director of the Oversight Board, heading up the staff, the full-time staff that support the board members as they deliberate on cases. I also have a background in human rights, but more recently now I've moved across into a new role heading up special projects for the board.
So I'd like to start off with Louisa. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Lou, initially the Oversight Board was really innovative for what it was doing, but now we've seen a lot of countries, particularly the EU, starting to put in place systems to ensure user redress. And when we're talking about that, we mean when users have content taken down, when they have an experience on the platform that they feel needs to be individually addressed, they have a way to get some accountability from the platform. So now we're seeing actual governments put laws and regulations into place. Do you get a sense that that's sort of diffusing the responsibility of the board? Does it change the way Meta is allocating resources and dealing with these issues because they aren't necessarily standardized?
I mean, first of all, I think I get to say that Meta, in establishing the Oversight Board, was industry leading, and now regulation is catching up. I think, look, the board has now been around for nearly 4 or 5 years, and I think we've really learned a lot about what self-governance models look like, and we always knew that user rights and individual redress were going to be at the heart of regulations. I think it's really interesting that the Digital Services Act in Europe has really honed in on this in terms of creating out-of-court dispute settlement bodies, which are all about user rights and individual redress. There's still a ton we don't know about how those emerging bodies are going to work in practice. And so I don't see it as being something that will diffuse the work of the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board, by its nature, is global, and these bodies, under the DSA at least, are European, although we know that the world is watching how this works. One thing that I would say in terms of resourcing, and obviously we are hugely focused on the reg readiness efforts to make sure we're in compliance with all of these emerging content regulations around the world. But I would say that there's a lot to still be understood about these bodies. There's no harmonized standards for how they're going to work in practice, and that's the area that I think the discussions really now need to focus on.
Got it. And Pamela, I think, obviously we've seen Europe really leading the way in regulation, and I think criticism that a lot of tech platforms have faced, not just Meta, is that they have sort of heavily resourced the global north, the US, Europe, and often at the expense or, are more reactive and, less responsive to users in the global south. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the way the Oversight Board maybe thinks about being a corrective to that issue.
I think one of the things that we have to take into account is how is the board comprised? It's today 21 members that come from completely diverse regions, languages, religions, professional backgrounds, ideological viewpoints. And what it brings together is how a platform that has global rules that apply to people that live all around the world, how we can actually make it work for people to actually have the right to freedom of expression, for people to actually have the right to feel safe when they use the platform and to be safe by using the platform, and to actually deserving to know why some content was taken down or why it wasn't, why they were censored or why they were hurt through online platform. And that is what the board does, seeing the different contexts, how Meta's policies apply throughout different countries, throughout different regions, what impacts they can have beyond what could be the remit of a specific regulation. Because I agree with what Lou said. We still don't know what those regulations are going to look like. But what we do know is that they will cross borders. And you cannot increase the gap that exists between global north and global majority, between the over and under-resourced countries. And the only one institution that today pays attention to what happens to speech, to protection in those regions is the Oversight Board. And I think that is something that is we have to acknowledge in a landscape that is constantly changing and in which we still have many interrogation marks.
Mm-hmm. And, I think when we think about the Oversight Board, Lou, you are correct. There was, when it was created, there was sort of nothing like it. But, Kat, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, what the future of the board might look like or initiatives like this, because other platforms haven't necessarily copied this model. And, now that we have sort of governmental bodies taking the initiative, what does the sustainability and future look like for initiatives like this from your perspective?
Certainly. I think, one of the perils in the structure of the Oversight Board is how singularly it was founded and funded, right, by one actor who had strong political will to do so. And while the board is, I think, still well-resourced, there was an idea, at least early on, that it might be something that would grow into a body that could support other platforms potentially, not just Meta. I don't think that what we're going to see is a significant investment from the largest tech companies in trying to build some additional form of adjudicatory or compliance mechanism in addition to all of the new regulatory and compliance mechanisms that they are navigating all over the world. We're already seeing a lot of resources from traditional trust and safety move over into compliance regimes and due diligence. So in terms of more things like the Oversight Board springing up, OpenAI made an announcement recently. And what was funny to me is that they were equating it to some degree with the Meta Oversight Board. Well, the Oversight Board is completely independent, right? Whereas the people who would be on the OpenAI safety board sit on OpenAI's board of directors. That's a fundamental, profound distinction between these two bodies. I have no idea if the Oversight Board will exist in 10 years. I don't know that Facebook will exist in its current form in 10 years. I do think that the lessons that we have learned from the process of creating the Oversight Board and the decisions that it has put out, the transparency reporting that it has done, the work that it has done on bringing in external opinions, on giving people those windows, I think there's a lot there that we will look back on at the very least and know it truly moved the space forward and really helped us think about the different types of governance mechanisms we need to have available to us and how you make that a more equitable process globally. I think at the very least, a lot of important lessons learned, at the very least.
And Tom, I'm curious because you obviously were a founding member of the board and now you're sort of working on something different. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Yes, certainly. So I'm not a member of the board, I should say. I'm a staff member helping the board members. I mean, to the points that have been raised, I don't think these things are all mutually exclusive. You don't have emerging statutory regulation, self-regulation, and other types of entities, right? It's an ecosystem that's going to have to work cooperatively together. If last year was sort of the year of legislation being passed, and yes, you focused, I think, on the European Union and the Digital Services Act for good reason, but we also see legislation in Korea and Brazil and India and Australia and the UK and so on. And a lot of that legislation which is being implemented this year, and I guess next year is going to be the year of enforcement, so that's going to be very interesting to see what that looks like. But there's a lot of commonalities in that legislation. All of it has things like codes of conduct. It all has areas like access to data for researchers, trusted flaggers. But there are two particular areas, I think, where the board has been the trailblazer, right? And the board has almost set the standard that really should be looked at and try to be emulated. One is around user redress and decision standards and the way the board applies international human rights standards to its decisions. And I think the other one is around recommendations and looking at the changes to the product design decisions that platforms take and the cumulative effect that has on individual rights. So to Lou's point, and also to Pamela's point as well, how these pieces of legislation are enacted will define whether they are going to be constructive and positive for users and user rights, create something scalable, accessible, affordable for users to be able to engage with, or whether it's going to become abused by governments, manipulated, chaotic, distracting, and actually block user rights. And there are certain key areas that I think are common across this legislation in setting standards where these new out-of-court dispute settlement bodies, maybe the board as well, regulators, platforms have to come together. And it's things like, what does it mean to engage in good faith from platforms? What do they have to provide these bodies with? What does it mean for these bodies if they say they have expertise? How are they going to make these things accessible? How do you prevent abuse of these mechanisms? How do you share data? How do you report data out so it can be used by journalists and other third parties? And if we get that right, then I think this is something very constructive. If we get that wrong, I think there's a big problem.
And Victoria, may I just
Yeah, of course.
one quick thing on that? I feel also that one of the big things we've seen in the development of trust and safety is that the differential capacity of a company like Meta or Google versus startups is enormous. And I do think that one of the other less championed but tremendous values of the Oversight Board and its opinions is that if you are an innovator and if you are trying to build a rights-respecting product or platform or tool from the ground up, I think that the reasoning in the Oversight Board decisions, the way that those have been structured, the way those are thought about, is actually quite helpful as you think through how you would architect your own platform that would be able to take those things into consideration. I do actually think it helps the innovation economy.
Well, and I guess this is a follow-up question for you, Pamela. Obviously, so many of the board's cases are individual. They are individual issues. And I'd like if you could talk about sort of in the selection process when you're thinking about issues that you see as forthcoming or urgent for Meta to figure out how to address or to have transparency around. Can you talk about what those issues are and how they frame the cases the board is choosing?
In the board, we decided to establish 7 strategic priorities that guide our the decisions we take and the decisions we move forward. But they also guide the way we look at decisions. One of the things we did from the outset is not only focus on was Meta right or was Meta wrong. The board is the only entity that has binding decisions to tell Meta this is kept up, this is restored, this is put down. But I don't think that's the most relevant part, precisely because it's individual cases in a huge volume and scale of content that goes through platforms. What is most relevant is those recommendations that can actually drive policy changes, that actually allow allow users to be treated fairly, that actually allow putting checks and balances on automation, for example, on the rights of minorities, of journalists, of people that live in oppressed societies. And it's through the lens of those strategic priorities that we choose that, but always with the logic of listening to stakeholders who have been working on these fields for a long time, understanding what their problems are, and driving more transparency from Meta, not only with the recommendations we ask of them, but also through the decisions. The information we provide in our decisions also seeks to provide more transparency as to how platforms work, how Meta's platforms work, and I think it's a standard that we should all expect from other platforms, especially the biggest platforms. They all say that they are committed to human rights, that they are committed to safety online, that they are committed to transparency. But the question at the end is, what are they doing to actually live up to that commitment? And I think regardless of all the questions and all the things we can say about Meta, if there's one thing that we have to acknowledge is that they did put themselves to be held accountable by a body that is completely independent and that tells them day in and day out where they're doing wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess this is a question for Lou. Kat mentioned this sort of movement from this sort of trust and safety into a more compliance sort of mindset or space in terms of staff and resources. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how much of that is really being driven by external legislation. Are we going to see maybe these two distinct fields within companies start to become one and the same?
Yeah, and it's interesting because before I joined the governance team, I spent nearly 5 years heading up the content litigation and regulatory teams in EMEA Legal. And so I'm certainly well versed in what regulatory compliance pressure looks like. I have to say, it doesn't feel that different from the pain and pressure of the oversight board. I think the reality of enabling an institution to have binding powers, even though it is a self-regulatory function, does mean that the things have a very similar feel. There's no doubt that a huge amount of resourcing is going into the regulatory compliance requirements. These laws are no joke. We're taking them incredibly seriously. I can also say that we're tracking from a policy, product and operations perspective the regulatory requirements alongside the non-binding recommendations of the board. So it's not so much a case of is one going to tip the other, at least for Meta. We obviously invest a huge amount in the board and want it to continue to succeed. I think one interesting point about the difference between the individual cases and the larger impact of the non-binding recommendations that the board makes is that I think the regulations are also sort of thinking in those terms. And so these new bodies in the EU, whilst they will be focused on individual user complaints, there's also a requirement for very large online platforms like Meta to take into account the trends and patterns and the individual decisions from those new emerging bodies into how we think about systemic risk, which is kind of what the board has already been doing in terms of taking its individual decisions and then looking through the wider lens at how it can impact a far greater subset of our users.
Well, we're almost at time, but Tom, I was wondering if you could sort of close us out in sort of talking a little bit about, obviously, user redress often, again, feels a lot like the individual, but when we're thinking about future regulation, maybe do you think the focus needs to shift more to a product lens more broadly rather than to individual issues around speech or usership?
Yeah, no, I think the two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think you actually need one to inform the other. To the point that Lou was just making, and also Pamela made earlier as well, if you have a large scale of individual decisions, that actually generates, for want of a better description, kind of a heat map. It allows you to see where some of the issues are, whether there's a hate speech issue in country X or from a particular community. And at the same time, you can use that to then inform where you prioritize mitigation of systemic risk when you are instructing or telling platforms, depending on your role as a regulator, what they need to do in terms of their product design choices. And that will then flow back down, right? Because you'll then see a change in the types of decisions you're seeing and so on. So again, I think this is an ecosystem where you need multiple actors. You need independent self-regulatory bodies that are going to set normative standards and make recommendations. You need individual users having access. You need civil society with access and academics with access to data. You need trusted flaggers. It's complex, to say the least. But again, if all these bodies can work together and if they can set the right standards, this could be very productive.
Well, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you all for being here with us.